Welcome back to the Apiary, a knitting podcast. Today's topic has been a little bit of a hot button issue lately in the knitting world, and it's about questions involving designers allegedly copying other designers. Now, just to avoid any potential confusion here, because I am a former lawyer with an inactive bar license, none of this is legal advice. If you do have legal questions about copyright or other intellectual property issues involving knitting patterns, you should consult with a person who's licensed to practice law in the relevant jurisdiction. So for today's video, if we're not going to talk about whether certain things are legal or not legal, how are we going to talk about this question? Well, simple. We're going to talk about some of the possible alternative explanations for what could look like copying at first glance. We're going to talk about some of the rules that I have set for myself as a designer when dealing with these sorts of situations. And we're going to talk about what I have observed about designers generally and the likelihood of true pattern copying even happening in the first place. So first up, if we haven't met yet, hi, I'm Lauren. I design knitting patterns. I focus on accessories with a special emphasis on socks. I love designing socks, but as you can see, I also do shawls and scarves and cowls and hats and fingerless mitts and whatever other accessories give me joy. I don't do garments because those give me a headache. I started writing my first knitting pattern back in 2017, and I've been knitting since 2007. So I have been in the fiber world for quite a while. And I feel like at this point, I've seen just about everything, including a couple of faked deaths. That also means I've seen a lot of situations where one designer is calling out another designer for allegedly copying one of their designs. And most of the time, there is actually a perfectly innocent explanation. So here are 4 really common scenarios, including one that's happened to me personally. The first common scenario that I see happen a lot is that the two designers are designing patterns for relatively simple finished objects. There are only so many ways to knit a stockinette beanie. My favorite example is a garter stitch scarf, right? What are you going to do to distinguish your garter stitch scarf from all of the others that have gone before it and all the others that will come after it? You can vary the number of stitches you cast on, you can choose an unusual yarn, you can use a different gauge, but that's about it. Garter stitch is garter stitch, and a scarf is a scarf. So if two designers both publish patterns for a very simple knit item, well, it's going to make sense that those simple knit items will look like each other because that's just the nature of the beast. A second common scenario is where two designers are trying to recreate the same already existing garment. And I see this happen most often in kind of 2 different categories of creators. One is in the historical reenactment community where people want to recreate versions of existing historical garments. And another common scenario is where people are recreating costume pieces from movies or TV shows. In all of those scenarios, the designers are not copying each other when they create a pattern for something that they saw in a historical costume book or on a TV show. They're just drawing inspiration from the same place. A third common scenario is where two designers are drawing inspiration from the same non-knitting source of inspiration. And this is the one that has actually happened to me, and it was pretty funny when it happened. So my friend Amy and I are both knitting pattern designers. Amy does more garments nowadays, and I have stuck with accessories. But several years ago, Amy and I were both churning out socks and hats and other things together. And when springtime came around, we were both thinking, springtime, pastels, fresh plant life. And wouldn't you know it, for springtime that year, we both designed a pair of pastel socks with a lacy leaf panel down the front. Now, neither of us had any idea that the other one was doing this, but when we figured it out, we both had a good laugh about it and had to talk about whether we thought the patterns were too similar, whether it would cause confusion among people, and we decided it was fine. The leaf panels were different. They were different style and shape leaves. Their pattern had a different style of cuff on it, and so we figured there wasn't likely to be any confusion. And if somebody thought that one of us had copied the other, we could easily tell them, hey, no, we talked about it ahead of time. We knew about this. This is not a problem. The fourth common scenario that I see is two designers that are working from the same Stitch dictionary. Now, Stitch dictionaries can be a wonderful resource, especially as you are moving into more complicated types of stitches. It does mean, though, that if you are getting your stitch texture for your design from a Stitch dictionary, it's entirely possible that another designer is also using that same stitch texture. And again, because there are only so many ways to shape things like socks and shawls, you may end up with a design that looks very similar to something that somebody else has already done or something that somebody else is going to come do after you. That's not because either of you copied each other, it's just because you were starting from the same starting place. Now, there are all sorts of additional perfectly innocent reasons why two knitting pattern designers might end up designing something that looks very similar. And because this is so common, I've come up with a few rules for myself as a designer for how I handle these things. Rule number 1 is that I would never take action without definite proof that somebody had copied my design. And for me, that would have to look like something like the person had seen a picture of the design in progress and then raced and released the exact same design right before I released mine. It would have to be something that clear. And because that is so rarely going to happen, you're so rarely going to have evidence that is that clear. For me, it would be extremely unlikely that I would ever say something publicly about someone that I even suspected of copying one of my designs. I might vent privately to a close friend or my husband or a good colleague, but I'm not going to publish anything. Rule number 2 for myself is that nobody can undercut me without my permission. And what I mean by that is that if somebody is able to come along after me and release a pattern that looks really similar to something I've already designed, and they're able to sell a lot of copies of that and make a dent in my own sales for my pattern, well then I haven't done my job of marketing my pattern effectively. I should have marketed that pattern well enough that anybody who wanted to knit a pattern that looked like it had already bought it by the time the second pattern came out. If I didn't do that, then I need to sit down and reevaluate my marketing plans going forward. And finally, my third rule for myself is no picking on smaller designers. I so often see scenarios where somebody with a really big following online accuses somebody with a much smaller following of copying one of their designs. And I'll be honest, most of the time that I have seen that happen, the designs have seemed pretty distinct to me. What I remember from those scenarios is not that somebody copied someone else. It's that a big designer picked on a small designer, that somebody with a lot more power in this industry picked on somebody with a lot less power, and did so publicly. It leaves a bad taste in my mouth every time. Now, I hang out in several different designer spaces online, and I see a real gamut of conversations between really seasoned, experienced designers and conversations from brand new beginning designers. One concern I often see very new designers raising is a worry that they might accidentally design something that looks just like something somebody else has done. And the odds are decent that you might. You might accidentally design something that looks just like something somebody else has done, especially if the design is relatively simple. But without getting into legal questions of intent, the knitting community understands as a matter of norms and community ethics that there's a difference between accidentally creating something that looks like something somebody else did and intentionally recreating something somebody else did. And when I've watched these conversations unfold online time and time again, you can see a real difference in the community response when it's pretty clear something was a coincidence or an accident versus when somebody was in fact intentionally copying someone else. As for the more experienced designers, I'll tell you this. My observation has been that the longer a person has worked as a designer in the fiber industry, the less likely they are to accuse someone of copying them. And there are a few reasons for that, I think. One is that the longer you're in this industry, the more you see the huge range of patterns that are out there. And you start realizing that very little of what any of us do is truly, truly unique and original. There are a few designers out there doing really kind of groundbreaking work. And one of my favorite examples of that is Woolly Wormhead with all of the creative ways that they construct hats. But the majority of us are working with kind of established shapes and established techniques. And we can remix them and twist them and flip them and do all sorts of different things with them. But ultimately, there is a chance that somebody else is doing the same thing and is going to come up with the same result, not on purpose, just because that's what happens. There are only so many ways to manipulate stitches. The other reason I think it is less likely for more established designers to call out others for alleged copying is that they understand the value of reputation in maintaining a business. Knitters have memories, long memories. Some of them even keep receipts. And so if you get caught acting like a bully or throwing around allegations of copying when it's pretty clear that's not what's going on, that's not going to go well. On the flip side, an established designer also understands that the easiest way to lose goodwill for your business is to actually get caught copying somebody else. Now, that's not to say there aren't bad actors out there. We've all seen the sloppy AI patterns that get churned out and sold for way too cheap because there was no actual human involved in creating them, and therefore they're not good patterns. There are, of course, also lazy designers who are just out to make a quick buck, and there are ignorant or uninformed designers who don't realize what the rules are. But every designer I've ever talked to, and I've talked to hundreds now over the years, has been very protective of their business. They want to do it well. They want to do it right. And part of doing it well and doing it right means maintaining a good reputation, being a good member of the community, being intellectually honest. So, does design copying happen? Sure, occasionally. But most of the time there's an innocent explanation. And that's part of why I'm such a big fan of Hanlon's razor. The short and quippy version, of course, is never attribute to malice what can be adequately explained by stupidity. But the more nuanced version is don't jump to the worst possible explanation for a concerning scenario when there are other perfectly innocent explanations that are just as likely. The last reason I think that more established designers are less likely to accuse somebody of design copying is that they understand the timelines involved in getting a design from idea to published pattern. They better understand the timeline involved in creating a good knitting pattern, testing it, and getting it released to the public. Most of my designs are running 6 to 12 months in advance. By the time you see a pattern released, I've been working on that thing for half a year to a year, sometimes even more. And so if two similar designs are released close in time to each other, there's just not really a feasible way for that to have happened and for it to have been copying. Before I started working on this video and the blog post that goes along with it, I spent some time racking my brain trying to think about any scenarios I had seen where somebody actually did copy someone else. And as I racked my brain trying to think over the last 18 years, I could really only think of one scenario where a designer had accused someone else of copying them, and I thought that it actually held some water. So because of that, whenever I see somebody accusing someone else of copying a design, I'm already a little bit skeptical, because I'm almost certain that, as in most scenarios, there's a perfectly innocent explanation for it. All right, that's it for this episode. Thanks for being here today, and I look forward to chatting with you again soon. Happy stitching.